Hello,
Hello, this is my colleague Jen Sacklin,
this is Maggie Mitteis.
and we are here today to present about integrating Deaf LESLLA learners into beginning level ESL classes.
So, a little bit about where we're coming from. We are English as a second language, or ESL teachers in the United States. We are not experts in deaf education, but because we've had Deaf LESLLA learners in our classrooms over the past couple of years, we've sort of taken a deep dive into this topic, and we wanted to share with you what we've learned so far. So in today's presentation, we'll talk a little bit about our program in context, we'll review the literature, and then go into some teaching strategies. So our program, we work in the United States, and there's a few key terms about deafness in the United States that I think it's important for everybody to know. So first, there is a distinction between lowercase d deaf and capital D deaf. Lowercase d deaf has much more of a medical focus and only means loss of hearing. However, capital D deaf is much broader, and that's what this quote refers to. Hearing loss is not the sole determiner of capital D deaf community membership, as this is crucially determined by the choice of sign language as the preferred language. So capital D deaf is much more about culture. Capital D deaf is an identity, and some even say that it's an ethnicity. To incorporate both the medical and cultural aspects of deafness, it's common to use this spelling that you see here with capital D / lowercase d, deaf. In the United States, we have American Sign Language, or ASL, and it's a visual language used by deaf, hard of hearing, and hearing people in the US. And a key piece of legislation is the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, which requires schools, including colleges, to provide schools such as ASL interpreters to deaf students, including ESL students.
So, Jen and I live and work in the city of Eugene in the state of Oregon, located on the west coast of the United States, and we work at Lane Community College. So, to start off, our city, Eugene, has 38,000 residents, and we are about 2 hours south in driving distance from the Portland metro area. LCC is a community college. Community colleges actually house all adult education in the state of Oregon. We do not have adult high schools. So, our community college has roughly 15,000 students, and these are workforce students, students who intend to transfer, or students who are taking classes with more of a community-minded focus. We do have ASL classes at Lane Community College, but in order to access those ASL classes, you have to have fluency in print English. It is also kind of assumed that you are a speaker of English and you have a certain mastery of that language. So within the community college, we have our English as a second language program, and we serve roughly 600 adult ESL students. Most of our students are resident students, which means they are in our community for the long haul. We do have some international students who are on F1 visas, but it is important to note that we do not have literacy only classes within our program. Most, or actually all, of our LESLLA learners are folded into our mainstream ESL classes, usually in our combined skills lower level classes. Also, our deaf students, because of the Americans with Disabilities Act, receive ASL interpretation as part of their accommodations. Those interpreters can join our classes in person or remotely, depending on interpreter availability. But it's really important to understand that these interpreters are trained to be interpreters. They translate one-to-one what is said in English in the ESL classroom to standardized ASL. They do not have any sort of training in working with ESL classes specifically.
The one key term to know is home sign. Over 90% of deaf children are born to hearing, non-signing parents. So, how do those children communicate with their parents? Well, maybe those parents go to their local community college and learn some American Sign Language to be able to sign with their child, but maybe not. And in that case, the child will likely invent a home sign. Home sign is a language created by a deaf child to communicate with their hearing, non-signing family to communicate their wants and needs. It's usually a gesture-based language, and it will have a stable lexicon and a morphological and syntactic structure. It is a language. Now, it's idiosyncratic. It's only used by that child and their family, but various linguists have studied various home signs, and they are languages. Now, it often becomes that person's sole means of communication, especially if the home signer is unable to go to school and learn the national standardized form of sign language or written language, or can't receive a cochlear implant or something to be able to enhance their hearing. So these are the learners that we're working with. Imagine you have a student who is from, pick a country, Turkey, and they never got to learn Turkish sign language. They just used home sign with their family. They immigrated to the United States, where they now have to learn English as a second language, written, and they do that via getting ASL, or American Sign Language interpretation, in class. So they're learning both written ESL and signed ASL at the same time. So our students have home sign as an L1. So a really brief review of literature. There is an overlap between deafness and literacy, and this is what we are particularly interested in. About 80% of deaf children worldwide have no opportunity to go to school. And as we know, literacy and schooling are interlaced concepts. And from a literacy perspective, which is where we're all coming from, about 20% of the worldwide pre-literate population has some degree of deafness. So as we're working with LESLLA learners, if we haven't yet encountered a deaf LESLLA learner, it's not that they don't exist, it's that they haven't found our program yet.
So as Jen and I were preparing for this presentation and also working with deaf students within our particular context, we went on a hunt for some sort of literature, case studies in particular, that we felt would mirror what we were seeing in our classrooms. And so these 4 studies in particular were the ones that gave us the most information. Our major takeaway was there will be communication issues between teachers and students and other students when you have a deaf learner in class. Also, a deaf learner, someone who is learning both sign language and written literacy, will move at a pace that is much slower than their hearing peers. Because students are being asked to learn both written language and a standardized form of sign at the same time, they will burn out much quicker than their hearing peers. Think of your kind of cognitive load and the space for the day. These students are literally burning the candle at both ends, and it's going to take time for them to kind of build up that learning muscle. So they will forget over and over and over as they try to build up those associations. The other thing that we found within these studies that was really helpful is students will build those associations if they see images or pictures that they are able to connect to their day-to-day life or things that are happening around them. Physical objects being brought into the classroom also help them to create those memories and create those associations. So as we were coming together, we really noticed that there were a couple of places that we particularly wanted to know more. First, we wanted more information about literacy learning and deaf adults. Of all of the studies that we encountered, we only found one that focused on adults. Every other study focused on kids. We also wanted to know more about working with individuals whose L1 is home sign. Everything that we read so far really focused on individuals who had had some form of standardized sign or had been oral at some point in their lives. As instructors, we also wanted more information on what we can actually do in the classroom that creates an effective space for deaf learners. And we were also kind of hoping to create a little bit more resources for teachers so that someone working in a similar context is not starting from scratch. So the first thing we have to really do in order to create these things is know what works.
So at last year's LESLLA 20th anniversary special conference, Jean Corvers gave a great presentation on what works in adult L2 literacy teaching. And I stole this slide from her presentation. And I've highlighted what works with deaf adults when learning L2 literacy. So everything that's highlighted here in blue works for both hearing and deaf learners. You can teach literacy to a deaf student in a very similar way that you teach literacy to a hearing student using all of these marked techniques. Now, what doesn't work are these 3 bullet points here. First, using an L1 or another well-known language in class. If your learner's first language is a home sign that only they and their family use, the teacher's not going to be able to access that to use as a resource in class. It's very difficult to teach phonics to a deaf learner. Oral vocabulary or any kind of vocabulary matters for hearing students, and it matters for deaf students. But again, if a deaf student's first language is a home sign that they created to communicate their wants and needs, they're probably only have signs for very concrete ideas and objects and actions. They may not have ever thought about creating a sign for anything abstract. And so teaching abstract ideas and abstract vocabulary in written ESL and in signed ASL can be very difficult for a deaf learner. So keeping all of those teaching strategies that do work in mind, Maggie's going to dive into what we've done in our classrooms.
So what Jen and I have done together is we've really adapted this schema to work particularly within our ESL context. So these are the 4 areas that we've identified that teachers need to have kind of in their thought process: classroom space, using interpreters, creating a code of communication, and finally bringing that all together to create teaching techniques that work for these particular students. So the first thing is setting up your classroom space. This is our current classroom, and the major thing that you need to consider when you are working with interpreters, whether they are in person or remote, is the lines of sight. The interpreter needs to be able to see the instructor and to see the student at all times. The student also needs to be able to see their interpreter and to see the instructor. So you are creating kind of that theatrical triangle that you need to maintain no matter how you or the student or the interpreter is being moved around the room. The other thing that we really considered is having an interpreter, whether it's remote or not, can create the feeling that a student is kind of chained to the computer that the interpreter's on, or chained to that kind of extra individual. So we wanted to create a classroom space that really encouraged students to stand up, move around, and build agency. And one of the ways that we really did this was with grammar posters. So you can see in this image, we have some kind of formula constructions for simple grammar. We have some conjugation posters. We have some just vocabulary focused posters that students can kind of manipulate, but also students can stand up, go check these posters, and utilize them throughout the class. It also, for not just deaf students, but for everyone that is acquiring basic literacy, it really feeds into the idea that we're adding a lot of information at all times. You don't need to keep all of it in your head at all times. You can stand up and you can go find the information that you need, building that agency. It also really does create a dynamic classroom. The other piece that I really appreciate about it is it demonstrates to students, as we add more and more posters, just how far they've come. You can see it here even in a single poster. This started as just subjects. Then we added to be, and then we continued to build even more complex grammar. Now we're working on not and kind of the contractions that go along with it. The next piece is how we set up the classroom for interpreters.
So this is a photo taken from a deaf student's perspective if they have a remote or Zoom interpreter. So there's a lot of devices in this photo, and I'm going to highlight them. So up at the very front of the room, you have the host laptop. So this is the teacher's laptop that they're using to host a Zoom session and present a Google Slides or PowerPoint presentation. This box up here at the front of the room on wheels is called a D10. It's basically a large touch screen that runs Zoom, and it has a camera in it and a very good microphone. So if there's a remote interpreter, they are hearing everything that's happening in the class via the microphone in the D10, and they can see in a broad sense what's happening in the classroom using the fisheye camera in the D10. This is the student's laptop, and this is how the student is directly communicating with the remote interpreter via the webcam on the laptop. So the student can see the interpreter up close, the interpreter can see the student up close, and this is where the signing happens back and forth when the student is sitting at their desk. And then everybody can see the projector screen up front, which is running a Google slideshow. That same Google slideshow is also shown on the D10, and if the student so chooses, on their laptop as well.
So using these interpreters, there's a lot of things we have to think about. First, the Zoom setup that Jen just went through. Secondly is a student's digital literacy skills. Are they going to be able to play any part in setting this up, or is this going to be a teacher responsibility? The other piece that we found is we've actually been able to enhance students' digital literacy skills by giving them a little bit more responsibility with this setup as they've grown in the class. There are certain constraints of the interpreter role. As we've said before, interpreters, their job is to interpret one-to-one what is said in the classroom. Some interpreters are very specific as to they will only stick to that role. Other interpreters are a little bit more able and willing to take on the role of tutor or helper to help students throughout the class and potentially explain things a little bit more. Because students are working with interpreters doesn't mean that they are totally, again, chained to that space. We just have to think a little bit more about how students are going to be able to stand up and move around. So here, for example, you can see that students are engaged in a small group question answer activity, but we've just put the group that requires the interpreter closer to the D10. And that's something that the instructor needs to give a little bit more consideration towards. Also, interpreters are a wealth of knowledge about working with students within the deaf community. They can explain grammar, they can explain experience, all of that. But again, interpreters are not trained to work in ESL classrooms. So I found giving interpreters just a quick 30-second overview of the classroom they're walking into and the best way to communicate with the students in that space is super, super helpful. So even though you have interpreters, that doesn't mean that you want to utilize interpreters in every interaction that you have with the student. And this is where the code of communication comes into play. In order to build this code, you really do have to think about students' literacy levels, their levels of hearing, and whether or not they're willing to utilize that hearing. Some of the things that we found really, really useful are just basic ASL. Some things like showing the sign you can use to show students to switch something, or the ASL sign for how to erase. But you don't need to know that many signs in ASL to work with deaf students. Broad gestures also go a long way. Come here or stay there. Also, as literacy low-level instructors, we act out a lot of things anyway. Most of those things will land directly with deaf students and they will understand. One of the major things we started utilizing in our class that we have found extremely helpful, it has actually become a cornerstone of instructions, are these things here that we call the grammar papers. So it started with just helping students understand subject-verb agreement. We turned that into a match game. Well, then we started kind of building it out. So here, students would be introduced a verb or a noun using the grammar paper and then reinforcing that with an image or an item in the room. So you can see here, we're using the grammar paper study, and we're reinforcing that, building the association with this image. And as students get more and more complex in their grammar, we also get more and more complex with our grammar papers. But the other thing that's been really, really helpful with this kind of grammar paper-based instruction is it gives students the means to communicate without having that kind of oral input. So you don't need to be able to speak to a partner to demonstrate that maybe the syntax is wrong. We can switch things around. Also, when you are a low-level literacy learner, you often depend on a lot of input from your classmates. The grammar papers really help us to replace that. So if you are unsure, you can kind of spy on your neighbors and see what else is going on and copy or kind of take that input from what they're doing. So we utilize those a lot to create equity in our classroom space. All right, so now we are bringing it all together. The things that we really want to consider when we are approaching teaching techniques are inclusion for everyone, not just deaf students, creating that equity and teaching effectiveness. And a lot of this actually happens before the students even arrive. Pre-class setup in this kind of a context is extremely important. So you can see here in this image, one of the things we do before we start any class is organize the grammar papers. Think very specifically about how we are going to give them out. So here we are just giving them out in sets because we're going to start building sentences right from the get-go. We also have to set up all the technology before class starts. So deaf students and hearing students really start class on an equal playing field. We also have a very specific daily routine. We do the same things over and over again with varying repetitions. So here you can see, again, we're utilizing the grammar papers, but now we've gotten into an extremely complex structure. We're starting to make questions. And again, we're using those same pieces to build different structures and to advance things. Here with the grammar papers, again, we are completing a test or a worksheet and reinforcing that idea of rapid word recognition, but also you do not need to be able to hold all this information in your head, but you do need to be able to recognize and find it. And to take it even further, we're using here a series of manipulative letters to have students work on recalling those words, but actually spelling them out for themselves. So now we've created this classroom, we've created the space, we've created the materials where all of those techniques that Jen talked about earlier are now equal and effective for everyone. And we're building that continual agency and independence. So moving beyond literacy is really our next step.
Exactly. And because this is a literacy conference, we're not going to spend time today talking about it. But if you want to talk to us during the coffee break about what we can do to move up to texts as complex as this, please come talk to us. Thank you very much for your time.
Jazz hands.